Book 1. The Purpose and Argument of this Work. Here, my dear Marcellinus, is the fulfillment of my promise, a book in which I have taken upon myself the task of defending the glorious city of God against those who prefer their own gods to the founder of that city. I treat of it both as it exists in the world of time, a stranger among the ungodly living by faith, and as it stands in the security of its everlasting seat. This security it now awaits in steadfast patience until justice returns to judgment. But it is to attain it hereafter in virtue of its ascendancy over its enemies, when the final victory is won and peace established. The task is long and arduous, but God is our helper. I know how great is the effort needed to convince the proud of the power and excellence of humility, an excellence which makes it soar above all the summits of this world, which sway in their temporal instability, overtopping them all with an eminence not arrogated by human pride, but granted by divine grace. For the king and founder of the city, which is our subject, has revealed in the scripture of his people the statement of the divine law: God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. This is God's prerogative, but man's arrogant spirit in its swelling pride has claimed it as its own, and delights to hear this verse quoted in its own praise: to spare the conquered and beat down the proud. Therefore, I cannot refrain from speaking about the city of this world, a city which aims at dominion, which holds nations in enslavement, but is itself dominated by that very lust of domination. I must consider this city as far as the scheme of this work demands and as occasion serves. Chapter 1. The enemies of Christianity were spared by the barbarians at the sack of Rome out of respect for Christ. From this world city, there arise enemies against whom the city of God has to be defended, though many of these correct their godless errors and become useful citizens of that city. But many are inflamed with hate against it and feel no gratitude for the benefits offered by its Redeemer. The benefits are unmistakable. Those enemies would not today be able to utter a word against the city if, when fleeing from the sword of their enemy, they had not found in the city's holy places the safety on which they now congratulate themselves. The barbarians spared them for Christ's sake, and now these Romans assail Christ's name. The sacred places of the martyrs and the basilicas of the apostles bear witness to this. For in the sack of Rome, they afforded shelter to fugitives, both Christian and pagan. The bloodthirsty enemy raged thus far, but here the frenzy of butchery was checked. To these refuges, the merciful among the enemy conveyed those whom they had spared outside, to save them from encountering foes who had no such pity. Even men who elsewhere raged with all the savagery an enemy can show, arrived at places where practices generally allowed by laws of war were forbidden, and their monstrous passion for violence was brought to a sudden halt. Their lust for taking captives was subdued. In this way, many escaped who now complained of this Christian era, and hold Christ responsible for the disasters which their city endured. But they do not make Christ responsible for the benefits they received out of respect for Christ, to which they owed their lives, reference to their own destiny, whereas, if they had any right judgment, they ought rather to attribute the harsh cruelty they suffered at the hands of their enemies to the providence of God. For God's providence constantly uses war to correct and chasten the corrupt morals of mankind, as it also uses such afflictions to train men in a right life, removing to a better state those whose life is approved, or else keeping them in this world for further service. Moreover, they should give credit to this Christian era for the fact that these savage barbarians showed mercy beyond the custom of war, whether they so acted in general in honor of the name of Christ, or in places specially dedicated to Christ's name, buildings of such size and capacity as to give mercy a wider range. For this clemency, our detractors ought rather to give thanks to God. They should have recourse to his name in all sincerity, so as to escape the penalty of everlasting fire, seeing that so many of them assumed his name dishonestly, to escape the penalty of immediate destruction. Among those whom you see insulting Christ's servants with such wanton insolence, there are very many who came unscathed through that terrible time of massacre, only by passing themselves off as Christ's servants. And now, with ungrateful pride and impious madness, they oppose his name in the perversity of their hearts, so that they may incur the punishment of eternal darkness. But then they took refuge in that name, though with deceitful lips, so that they might continue to enjoy this transitory light. Chapter 2. That victors should spare the vanquished out of respect for their gods is something unexampled in history. We have the records of many wars, both before the foundation of Rome and after its rise to power. Let our enemies read their history and then produce instances of the capture of any city by foreign enemies, when those enemies spared any whom they found taking refuge in the temples of their gods. Let them quote any barbarian general who gave instructions at the storming of a town that no one should be treated with violence who was discovered in this temple or that. Aeneas saw Priam at the altar, polluting with his blood the fire which he had consecrated. And Diomedes and Ulysses slew all the warders of the citadel, and snatched with bloody hands the sacred image, nor shrank to touch the chaplets virginal of the dread goddess. And there is no truth in this statement that comes after. The Grecian hopes then failed and ebbed away. For what in fact followed was the Greek victory, the destruction of Troy by fire and sword, the slaughter of Priam at the altar. And it was not because Troy lost Minerva that Troy perished. What loss did Minerva herself first incur, that led to her own disappearance? Was it perhaps the loss of her guards? There can be no doubt that their death made her removal possible. The image did not preserve the men were preserving the image. Why then did they worship her? To secure her protection for their country and its citizens. She could not guard her own keepers. Chapter 3. The folly of the Romans in confiding their safety to the household gods who failed to protect Troy. There you see the sort of gods to whom the Romans gladly entrusted the preservation of their city. Pitiable folly, yet the Romans are enraged by such criticisms from us, while they are not incensed at the authors of such quotations. In fact, they pay money to become acquainted with their works, and they consider that those who merely instruct them in these works merit an official salary and an honored position in the community. Virgil certainly is held to be a great poet. In fact, he is regarded as the best and the most renowned of all poets, and for that reason, he is read by children at an early age. They take great draughts of his poetry into their unformed minds, so that they may not easily forget him, for as Horace remarks, "New vessels will for long retain the taste of what is first poured into them." Now, in Virgil, Juno is introduced as hostile to the Trojans, and when she urges Aeolus, king of the winds, against them, she says, "A race I hate sails the Etruscan sea, bringing to Italy Troy's vanquished gods and Troy itself." Ought the Romans, as prudent men, to have entrusted the defense of Rome to gods unable to defend themselves? Juno no doubt spoke like a woman in anger, heedless of what she was saying. But consider what is said by Aeneas himself, who is so often called the pious. Panthus, the priest of Phoebus and the citadel, snatching his conquered gods and his young grandson, rushes in frenzy to the door. He does not shrink from calling the gods conquered, and he speaks of them as being entrusted to him rather than the other way around, when he is told, "To thee Troy now entrusts her native gods." If Virgil speaks of such gods as vanquished and tells how after their overthrow They only succeeded in escaping because they were committed to the care of a man. What folly it is to see any wisdom in committing Rome to such guardians, and in supposing that it could not be sacked while it retained possession of them. To worship vanquished gods as protectors and defenders is to rely not on divinities but on defaulters. It is not sensible to assume that Rome would have escaped this disaster had these gods not first perished. The sensible belief is that those gods would have perished long before, had not Rome made every effort to preserve them. Anyone who gives his mind to it can see that it is utter folly to count on invincibility by virtue of the possession of defenders who have been conquered, and to attribute own destruction to the loss of such guardian deities as these. In fact, the only possible cause of destruction was the choice of such perishable defenders. When the poets wrote and sang of vanquished gods, it was not because it suited their whim to lie. They were men of sense, and truth compelled them to admit the facts. But I must deal with the subject in fuller detail in a more convenient place. For the present, I will return to the ingratitude of those who blasphemously blame Christ for the disasters which their moral perversity deservedly brought upon them. And I will deal with the subject as briefly as I can. They were spared for Christ's sake, pagans though they were, yet they scorned to acknowledge this. With the madness of sacrilegious perversity, they used their tongues against the name of Christ, yet with those same tongues they dishonestly claimed him in order to save their lives. Or else, in places sacred to him, they held their tongues through fear. They were kept safe and protected there where his name stood between them and the enemy's violence. And so they issue from that shelter to assail him with curses of hate. Chapter 4. Juno's sanctuary in Troy gave no security from the Greeks, whereas the apostolic basilicas at Rome gave protection from the barbarians. As I said before, Troy itself, the mother of the Roman people, could not, by means of the consecrated buildings of its gods, save its citizens from the fire and sword of the Greeks, although they worshipped the same gods. In Juno's sanctuary, the chosen warders, Phoenix and dread Ulysses, keep safe the spoils, and there is heaped Troy's wealth, plunder from burning shrines, the golden bowls, the tables of the gods, the captured vestments. And near them stand the boys and trembling matrons, rank upon rank. That is to say, a place consecrated to so great a goddess was chosen not as a place from which prisoners might not lawfully be taken out, but as a place where the victors might at pleasure shut up their captives. This sanctuary was not the temple of any common god of the lower orders of deities, but that of the sister and wife of Jove himself, the queen of all the gods. Now contrast it with the memorial shrines of our apostles. To the former were taken the spoils from the burning temples and gods, not to be given to the vanquished, but to be divided among the victors. To the latter was carried with honor and most scrupulous reverence all that belonged to those places which was found elsewhere. There, freedom was lost. Here, it was preserved. There, men were herded by foes who exercised their power by sending them into slavery. Here, they were conducted by foes who showed their pity by setting them free. In short, the greedy arrogance of the contemptible Greeks chose that temple of Juno for its display. The humble clemency of the barbarians, uncouth as they were, chose those basilicas of Christ. It may be that the Greeks in their victory spared the temples of the common gods and refrained from hurting or enslaving the poor conquered Trojans who took refuge there. If so, Virgil, in the manner of poets, did not tell the truth about it. In fact, he gives the familiar picture of the sack of a city by its enemies. Chapter 5. Cato's description of the sack of a city according to the customs of war. According to Sallust, a historian renowned for his veracity, Cato, in making his proposal about the conspirators, was careful to remind the Senate of the usual consequences when cities are sacked. Maidens and boys are carried off, children are torn from parents' embrace, mothers are subjected to the pleasure of the conquerors, temples and homes are despoiled. There is fire and slaughter everywhere. The scene is crowded with fighting men, with dead bodies, with bloodshed and lamentation. If he'd omitted the mention of temples, we might have supposed that it was the custom for enemies to spare the abodes of gods. Yet the Roman temples had to dread this fate, not at the hands of foreign foes, but at the hands of Catiline and his associates, that is, of Roman citizens and senators of the highest birth. But they, to be sure, were men without conscience, murderers of the land that bore them. Not even the Romans spared the conquered and the temples of captured cities. Why should I survey in this argument the wars waged by many nations, which supply no instance of mercy shown the conquered in the abodes of their gods? Let us observe the Romans themselves, let us give them further examination. It was said of them, in their particular praise, that it was their custom to spare the conquered and beat down the proud, and that they chose rather to pardon than to avenge the wrongs they suffered. To extend their dominions, these Romans captured, stormed, or overthrew many mighty cities. Do we ever read of any privilege extended to certain temples to ensure that any who took refuge in them should be given their freedom? Or did they act thus, even though the historians fail to mention it? These historians particularly look for points to praise. Is it likely that they would omit actions which, by their own standards, would be most convincing evidence of religious feeling? That great Roman, Marcus Marcellus, who captured the splendid city of Syracuse, is said to have wept over its coming downfall and to have shed his own tears before shedding Syracusan blood. He also took care to preserve the honor of his enemies, for before he ordered the invasion of a town, the victor issued an edict that no violence should be done to the person of any free citizen. And yet, that city was overthrown in the usual manner of warfare, and there is no record of any proclamation by that honorable and merciful commander to order that anyone who fled to this temple or that should be immune from harm. And this would certainly not have passed unrecorded, since the record should not allow his weeping to remain unmentioned, nor his edict utterly forbidding the violation of his enemy's honor. Fabius, who crushed Tarentum, is commended for having abstained from plundering images. For when his secretary inquired what were his commands about the statues of the gods, many of which had been captured, he seasoned his moderation with a joke. He asked what sort of images they were, and on being told that many of them were of impressive size, and some were even armed, he said, "Let us leave the Tarentines their angry gods." Now, since the Roman chroniclers could not fail to mention the tears of one and the jocularity of the other, the honorable clemency of Marcellus and the humorous moderation of Fabius, is it likely that they would omit to record it if these two had shown mercy to any man out of respect for their gods by forbidding massacre or enslavement in some temple or other? Chapter 7. In the sack of Rome, the cruelties conformed to the conventions of war. The acts of clemency were due to the power of Christ's name. All the devastation, the butchery, the plundering, the conflagrations, and all the anguish which accompanied the recent disaster at Rome were in accordance with the general practice of warfare. But there was something which established a new custom, something which changed the whole aspect of the scene. The savagery of the barbarians took on such an aspect of gentleness that the largest basilicas were selected and set aside to be filled with people to be spared by the enemy. No one was to be violently used there, no one snatched away. Many were to be brought there for liberation by merciful foes. None were to be taken from there into captivity, even by cruel enemies. This is to be attributed to the name of Christ and the influence of Christianity. Anyone who fails to see this is blind. Anyone who sees it and fails to give praise for it is thankless. Anyone who tries to stop another from giving praise is a madman. Let us hope that no one with any sense will ascribe the credit for this to the brutal nature of the barbarians. Their fierce and savage minds were terrified, restrained, and miraculously controlled by him who long ago said, through his prophet, I will visit their iniquities with a rod and their sins with scourges, but I will not disperse my mercy from them. Chapter 8. Blessings and disasters, often shared by good and bad. No doubt this question will be asked. Why does the divine mercy extend even to the godless and ungrateful? The only explanation is that it is the mercy of one who makes his sun rise on the good and on the bad, and sends rain alike on the righteous and unrighteous. Some of the wicked are brought to penitence by considering these facts and amend their impiety, while others, in the words of the apostle, despise the riches of God's goodness and forbearance in the hardness and impenitence of their hearts, and lay up for themselves a store of wrath in the day of God's anger and of the revelation of the just judgment of God, who will repay every man according to his actions. Yet the patience of God still invites the wicked to penitence, just as God's chastisement trains the good in patient endurance. God's mercy embraces the good for their cherishing, just as his severity chastens the wicked for their punishment. God, in his providence, decided to prepare future blessings for the righteous, which the unrighteous will not enjoy, and sorrows for the ungodly, with which the good will not be tormented. But he has willed that these temporal goods and temporal evils should befall good and bad alike, so that the good things should not be too eagerly coveted, when it is seen that the wicked also enjoy them, and that the evil should not be discreditably shunned, when it is apparent that the good are often afflicted with them. The most important question is this: what use is made of the things thought to be blessings, and of the things reputed evil? The good man is not exalted by this world's goods, nor is he overwhelmed by this world's ills. The bad man is punished by misfortune of this kind, just because he is corrupted by good fortune. However, it often happens that God shows more clearly his manner of working in the distribution of good and bad fortune. For if punishment were obviously inflicted on every wrongdoing in this life, it would be supposed that nothing was reserved for the last judgment. On the other hand, if God's power never openly punished any sin in this world, there would be an end to belief in providence. Similarly, in respect of good fortune, if God did not grant it to show some petitioners with manifest generosity, we should not suppose that these temporal blessings were his concern. While if he bestowed prosperity on all just for the asking, we might think that God was to be served merely for the sake of those rewards, and any service of him would prove us not godly, but rather greedy and covetous. This being so, when the good and the wicked suffer alike, the identity of their sufferings does not mean that there is no difference between them. Though the sufferings are the same, the sufferers remain different. Virtue and vice are not the same, even if they undergo the same torment. The fire which makes gold shine makes shafts smoke, the same flail breaks up the straw and clears the grain, and oil is not mistaken for less because both are forced out by the same press. In the same way, the violence which assails good men to test them, to cleanse and purify them, affects in the wicked their condemnation, ruin, and annihilation. Thus the wicked, under pressure of affliction, execrate God and blaspheme. The God in the same affliction offer up prayer. The good in the same affliction offer up prayers and praises. This shows that what matters is the nature of the sufferer, not the nature of the sufferings. Stir a cesspit, and a foul stench arises. Stir a perfume, and a delightful fragrance ascends. But the movement is identical. Chapter 9. The reasons why the good and the wicked are equally afflicted. Thus, in the universal catastrophe, the sufferings of Christians have tended to their moral improvement, because they viewed them with the eyes of faith. First, they consider in humility the sins which have moved God's indignation, so that he has filled the world with dire calamities, and although they are free from criminal and godless wickedness, still they do not regard themselves as so far removed from such wrongdoing as not to deserve the temporal ills which are the recompense of sin. Every one of them, however commendable his life, gives way at times to physical desires, and while avoiding monstrous crimes, the sink of iniquity and the abomination of godlessness is yet guilty of some sins, and frequent sins, perhaps, or more frequent because more trivial. Apart from this, it is not easy to find anyone who, when confronted with those whose fearful arrogance, lust, and greed, whose detestable wickedness and impiety have caused God to give effect to his threats and warnings by bringing destruction on the earth. It is not, I say, easy to find anyone who regards such men as they should be regarded, who, when he meets them, treats them as they should be treated. We tend culpably to evade our responsibility when we ought to instruct and admonish them, sometimes even with sharp reproof and censure, either because the task is irksome or because we are afraid of giving offense. Or it may be that we shrink from incurring their enmity for fear that they may hinder and harm us in worldly matters, in respect either of what we eagerly seek to attain or of what we weakly dread to lose. And so, although the good dislike the way of life of the wicked, and therefore do not fall into the condemnation which is in store for the wicked after this life, nevertheless, because they are tender towards damnable sins of the wicked, and thus fall into sin through fear of such people, pardonable and comparatively trivial though those sins may be, they are justly chastised with afflictions in this world, although they are spared eternal punishment, and they rightly feel this life to be bitter when they are associated with the wicked in the affliction sent by God. But it was through love of this world's sweetness that they refuse to be bitter to those sinners. If anyone refrains from reproof and correction of ill-doers because he looks for a more suitable occasion, or because he fears that this will make them worse, or fears they will hinder the instruction of others who are weak in a good and godly way of life, and that they will oppress them and turn them away from the faith, in such a case, the action seems to be prompted not by self-interest, but by counsels of charity. What is culpable is when those whose life is different and who abhor the deeds of the wicked are nevertheless indulgent to the sins of others, which they ought to reprehend and reprove, because they are concerned to avoid giving offense to them, in case they should harm themselves in respect of things which may be rightly and innocently enjoyed by good men, but which they desire more than is right for those who are strangers in this world, and who fix their hope on a heavenly country. They are the weaker brothers in the married state. There are the weaker brothers in the married state who have children or look to have them, who are masters of houses and households. The apostle addresses them in the churches, teaching them and warning them how they ought to live, wives with husbands, and husbands with wives, children with parents, and parents with children, servants with masters, and masters with servants. Such men are eager to acquire many of this world's temporal goods and grieve to lose them, and for that reason they have not the heart to offend men whose lives of shame and crime they detest. But they are not alone. Even those who have a higher standard of life, who are not entangled in the bonds of marriage, who are content with little food and scanty clothing, are often fearful of attacks by the wicked upon their reputation and their safety, and so refrain from reproaches. They are not so afraid of the wicked as to yield to their villainous threats to the extent of committing crimes like theirs. But though they do not commit them, they too often fail to reprehend them. For although they might perhaps convert some by such rebuke, they fear that, if the attempt failed, their safety and reputation might be endangered or destroyed. And this is not due to prudence, nor is it because they see the reputation and safety as essential means whereby mankind may receive the benefit of instruction. It is rather due to weakness, because they delight in flattery and popularity, and because they dread the judgment of the mob and the torture or death of the body. In fact, they are constrained by self interest, not by the obligations of charity. So, this seems to me a major reason why the good are chastised along with the evil, when God decides to punish moral corruption with temporal calamities. Good and bad are chastised together, not because both alike live evil lives, but because both alike, though not in the same degree, love this temporal life. But the good ought to have despised it, so that the others might be reformed and corrected, and might aim at life eternal. Or if they refuse to be partners in this enterprise, so that they might be borne with and loved as Christians should love their enemies, since in this life it is always uncertain whether or not they are likely to experience a change of heart. In this matter, a uniquely heavy responsibility rests on those to whom this message is given by the prophets. He indeed will die in his sin, but I will require his blood at the hand of the watchman. For watchmen, that is, leaders of the people, have been appointed in the churches for this purpose, that they should be unsparing in their condemnation of sin. This does not mean that a man is entirely free from blame in this regard if, without being a watchman, he recognizes but ignores opportunities of warning and admonishing those with whom the exigencies of this life force him to associate, if he evades this duty for fear of offending them, because he is concerned for those worldly advantages which are not in themselves discreditable, but to which he is unduly attached. There is a further reason for the infliction of temporal suffering on the good, as is seen in the case of Job, that the spirit of man may be tested, that he may learn for himself what is the degree of disinterested devotion that he offers to God.